Fellas, in the sport of MMA, or specifically the UFC, there's not one fighter in the UFC that you can say is the undeniable greatest of all time. Everyone has different opinions of who's the greatest of all time, and for that reason, there just can't be one. So I'm going to go through the GOAT list, the list of the fighters who most people think are the greatest, and saying what each of these guys could have done to make themselves the solidified, undeniable greatest of all time in the UFC. The one career move that maybe would have changed it, whether it means beating a certain fighter or doing a certain thing, whatever it may be, what these guys in the GOAT list could have done to become the greatest of all time. Let me know if I should have included anyone else in this list, or if you'd, agree or disagree with these takes. Starting off with the first fighter in the GOAT list, and this ain't in any order, by the way, this is just a random order, but starting off with the first fighter, we have GSP. GSP, a lot of people think he's the greatest of all time. I definitely put him in top 2. But for GSP, the one thing in my opinion that definitely would have pushed him towards being the greatest of all time more undeniably is having one more title defense in the middleweight division. His career was practically flawless. He had 2 losses on his record, which he ended up winning again in the future. He had a lot of title defenses. He was dominant for a long time. He was super skilled, super well-rounded. And then even after that, he comes back 4 years later to meet Michael Bisping. But even though he had this, insane achievement, I think if GSP would have beaten a guy like maybe, I don't know, Yoel Romero or Robert Whittaker after beating Bisping and had an extra defense on his middleweight, had a defense on his middleweight resume, I think GSP would have been the undeniable greatest of all time. I mean, first of all, the UFC would have promoted him a lot more. You see, whenever Dana White and the UFC are talking about welterweight and who's the greatest welterweight of all time, they love avoiding GSP, and that's because they're still salty that GSP never defended his middleweight belt and just quit after he beat Bisping. So I feel like the UFC would have definitely been pushing GSP a lot more to the, a lot of the audience, and maybe convincing them that he's the greatest. Second of all, I think it would have been a lot more impressive for GSP to go out there and beat a guy like Whittaker, because let's be honest, the reason he came back and fought Bisping was because he knew that Bisping was an easy fight for him. He knew it. That's why he chose Bisping and not these other fighters. He knew that coming back to Bisping would have been an easy win for him, and I feel like if he'd have defended against a tougher guy, not to take away from Bisping by the way, but if he'd have defended against a tougher stylistic matchup for GSP in Whittaker or Yoel Romero, I think it would have been more undeniable that he's the greatest of all time. So that's what I think GSP should have done. If he'd have had even just one more defense on his middleweight belt that he came back and won, I think that would have been great for him. So that's my thoughts on GSP. Then we've got Jon Jones. Most people think Jon Jones is the greatest of all time, and I do, to be honest with you. But the one thing that Jon Jones could have done to 100% be the greatest of all time, because he's already got everything. He's got this massive, massive list of title defenses. He's beaten 3 generations of champions. He's dominated so many fighters. He's won a belt in 2 weight classes. So in my opinion, the one thing that Jon Jones should have done to become the greatest of all time is just never take steroids. It's the obvious answer. Whenever someone says that Jon Jones isn't the greatest of all time, the only thing that they can possibly say is the fact that he took steroids. The fact that he had an unfair advantage. Most people, well, not most people, but some people think if he takes steroids, he should be immediately eliminated from the greatest of all time conversation. He ended up losing his belt and having to take time off because he took steroids as well, which definitely took a hit in his career. So, in my opinion, it's not even just an opinion, it's a fact, to be honest with you. If Jon Jones never took steroids, he would be the greatest of all time. There's no other argument you can make. He's achieved more than anyone in this sport, but because he took steroids and because he took PEDs, it's always going to leave a bad mark on his record, on his resume. So that's my thoughts on Jon Jones. If he never took steroids, 100%, I think a lot of people would agree that he is the greatest of all time. Then we've got Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, I don't think a lot of people think Khabib is the GOAT. I think there's a small minority of MMA fans that think that Khabib Nurmagomedov is the greatest of all time. And I feel like the people that think that don't really watch the sport. I feel like most Khabib fans know who Khabib is and what he did, but I don't think they really watch the sport, so they just say that he's the greatest of all time. But with that being said, I do think Khabib is definitely in the top 10 greatest of all time. I mean, you've got to admit, he was one of the most dominant fighters in his prime. He took over the lightweight division, and obviously, most importantly, he was undefeated and got 3 defenses. But 3 defenses just ain't enough to be the greatest of all time. You're competing with guys that are getting like 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 defenses, and you've got 3 against Conor McGregor, Justin Gaethje, and Dustin Poirier. you can't have a title run that short and be the greatest of all time. And he won the belt off Al Quinta as well, which isn't that impressive. So in my opinion, Khabib needs to get at least 5 more defenses to be competing with guys like Jones. If you want to say that Khabib is the greatest of all time, he needed to have at least 4 or 5 more title defenses against solid opponents in different matchups, because 3 defenses against those guys ain't enough. I would have loved to see Khabib against a grappler, him against like a Tony Ferguson in his prime, or imagine we got to see like a Khabib versus Oliveira and another defense on Khabib's record. I think it would have definitely pushed Khabib a lot more, higher up on the greatest of all time list, because 3 defenses ain't enough. So Khabib, as dominant as he was, he needs to get more defenses than 3. He retired way too early. I know why he retired, but unfortunately, I just don't think that makes him the greatest of all time. Next up on the list, we've got Anderson Silva. Now, the problem with Silva is that there's a lot of things that stops him from being the greatest of all time. Just like Jon Jones, he has taken steroids in the past, but he's definitely one of the greatest. In his prime, he looked like he was so far ahead of everyone. He dominated the middleweight division, setting records on people. He was just so dominant in his prime on his streak. But the one thing that I think really stops Silva from being the greatest of all time is that one loss to Chris Weidman. Now, the reason I say that specific fight is because I feel like that fight is really what spiraled the downfall of Anderson Silva. Ever since that first knockout loss to Chris Weidman, he then ended up only winning 1 more fight in his entire UFC career after that, to Derek Brunson. And he went on this massive losing streak. He broke his leg in his next fight against Chris Weidman. And I feel like he could have definitely beaten Chris Weidman. It seemed like he was playing with his food when he was fighting Chris Weidman. If he'd have just taken him a little bit more seriously and got that finish or got that win over Chris Weidman, for all we know, he could have never, gone in this massive losing streak. I'm not saying he would have beaten these guys that he lost to, but I don't think his losing streak would have been as, as bad. And then maybe he never even would have broken his leg, which he did against Chris Weidman in the rematch. Sure, for Anderson Silva, I feel like that was probably the worst loss of his career, just because of what it did to his career. And maybe he would have gone on to win a lot more fights and get a much bigger record, a much longer resume. So for Anderson Silva, even though there's a lot of things stopping him from being the greatest of all time, I think the Chris Weidman loss, the first one, definitely stops him and definitely caused a lot of problems in his career. So I'm going to say that fight is the worst for for Anderson Silva. And then finally, Demetrius Johnson. Some people think Demetrius Johnson's the greatest of all time. Personally, I think he's the most skilled fighter of all time. I think he's super well-rounded. And this guy dominated the flyweight division. But I don't think this guy could have done anything to become the greatest of all time. I feel like Demetrius Johnson did everything in his power to become the greatest of all time. He just did everything in his power. He took over every single flyweight that he fought. Maybe he could have won a belt in a different weight class, which probably would have pushed him higher, but I feel like he did everything in his power. He took over every flyweight. He outskilled everyone. I know he had 1 or 2 losses on his record here and there, but I don't think those losses necessarily stop him from being the greatest. So it was mainly the UFC's fault. They traded Demetrius Johnson for Ben Askren. They said, get out the UFC, we're bringing in Ben Askren to get knocked out by Masvidal. And yeah, because they traded him for Ben Askren, it stopped Demetrius Johnson from building an even bigger resume in the UFC, which I think could have definitely improved his chances of being the greatest of all time. So for Demetrius Johnson, I don't think it was really in his power. I think the UFC had a lot to do with this. So I'm going to say Demetrius Johnson couldn't have really done anything. Maybe, like I said, win a belt in a different weight class, but apart from that, there's not much he could have done. And yeah, that's my list of the top 5 greatest of all time, or at least the top 5 that could have done something. Let me know if you'd include anyone else in this list. Maybe you'd include Aldo or something. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this list and if you'd agree with the takes that I've got. Thank you for watching.